We're going to talk to Dr. Greg Pike, who is the director of Southern Cross Bioethics Institute in South Australia. Welcome to WFAD, Dr. Pike.
Thank you, Togni.
We have understood that there is quite a lot of turmoil when it comes to drug-related issues in Australia. There has recently been a legalisation debate, but if we should start off with the drug situation, could you elaborate a bit on that, please?
Sure. I think a lot of people will be aware that Australia has one of the worst drug situations out of many OECD countries. We have relatively high levels of use, and some of our particular problem drugs seem to be amphetamines and ecstasy use, which are both very high. But the problems have waxed and waned somewhat over the years, and at the moment there is a small decline, but I tend to put that down to a lot of good scientific information coming out about cannabis use and the link with psychosis, and I think that's a bit sobering for some people, and so the use rates are declining slightly. But in the past it has been much worse, and if we look at, say, opiates, for example, we had about 1,100 deaths, and I think it was about the year 2000 or 99 or 2000, when our price of heroin was quite low. Interestingly, when the price went up, of course, the number of overdoses dropped dramatically because there was less availability around the place, and so less were using. So there's that level of the drug problem, if you like, and of course it extends to a lot of other people in individual use, and everyone's aware of that. But the other problem that we have related to the drug issue is that some people in the more permissive movements have, if I can put it that way, or put it bluntly, the legalisation movement, have seen Australia as a fertile ground for implementing more permissive policies, and I think that's just the particular form of liberal democracy we have, and the way that the particular form of harm minimisation has been applied here in Australia, which is in a very liberal sense, small L liberal sense. And so there's been pressure here to liberalise. One of the things which we saw many years ago, and now it seems so many years ago, about nearly 10 years ago, was an attempt to introduce heroin trials, really on the tails of the Swiss heroin trials. So far, Australian governments have resisted that, but there seems to be a slight increase in the pressure at the moment to liberalise, and you referred to this debate last night that we had here in Sydney, and that debate was really quite blunt. It was about the legalisation of all drugs, and so that pressure certainly remains in our community, and we have some key players from the international stage here in Australia who are very vocal about their views about drug legalisation.
What would be their motive to propose legalisation of drugs, do you think, especially when they say that all drugs should be legalised? I mean, yes. What would be the motives?
Well, I think it's certainly a really odd proposition, talking about all drugs, because you can sort of you can see that those people are a bit keener with drugs like cannabis and certainly more sedative type drugs, but it becomes an extremely difficult case to run for things like cocaine and amphetamine, where you're really winding people up. The motivation, look, that's a really interesting question, and it's hard to really divine where this comes from. I think part of the motivation is a really misplaced compassion myself. I think that there's an overly compassionate view which is directed towards users whose lives have become deeply dysfunctional, and when that's sort of uncoupled from a rational sense of what you might call human goods, or what are really good for human beings that enable them to flourish, when that's disconnected from that, and it becomes a focus just on how to make it better in general terms for those dysfunctional lives, then people really lose sight of the other vulnerable parties within the community who will be affected by the types of policies they want to implement. So, for example, implementing a medically supervised injecting centre, as we have here in Australia, there's one in Sydney that's been operating for some time, it seems to be a bland assertion that the provision of a so-called safe place to inject like that will have no impact on the rest of the community. But the perception and the message sent is a very profound one, that it says effectively that if you do get yourself into trouble with injecting whatever drug, whether it's opiates or amphetamines, that someone, namely the state, will make every attempt to look after you and enable you to do that, in inverted commas, safely. And I think that's a very powerful message, and certainly one of the points that I'm keen to highlight in this sort of debate is that those policies directed in a narrow way to persistent users have very profound impacts on the vulnerable parties within the community, most notably children. And I think those are the ones, those members of our community, the children, are the ones who are at risk of being inducted into a sense of normalisation about drugs, that they will then perceive that this has become something that is a relatively normal and legitimate activity, and the government will protect you from the harmful consequences.
And what about support from the general public?
Well, that's the interesting thing, you see. The general public is near overwhelming in its opposition to any legalisation of drugs. In fact, the questions which have been asked not only relate to legalisation, but they relate to moral disapproval. And the Australian population generally has a very poor view of the use of drugs, which is interesting because I'm not sure that the public has really thought carefully about some of the problems we also have with alcohol, and that some of the problems we have with binge drinking are quite significant at the moment. And in some respects, when people binge drink and get completely dangerously affected like that, it's not terribly dissimilar to the effects that happen with some of the other drugs. So there needs to be an acceptance that both are deeply problematic. But at least, as far as the illicit drugs go, people are recognising that there are significant problems, and interestingly that it's a moral/ethical problem. And so they're overwhelmingly opposed to any legalisation. So at least we have that sort of democratic sense of support.
And what about the politicians? Would the majority of the politicians be in favor of a more tolerant drug policy or even legalization?
Well, I think that's where our problem lies, because I think the people who are in favor of legalization and more tolerant policies are very, very effective in their influencing of politicians. And what has happened in Australia recently with regard to our political landscape, particularly at the federal level, is the rise of the Greens. And the Greens have been, here in Australia at least, very specific in their very tolerant position about drugs and drug use, they say, rather than abuse, interestingly. But that particular rise of the Greens has meant for Australia a particular degree of power held by the Greens, the balance of power, which means that their policies are finding much more prominence than they did in the past. And so that adds to the influence on other politicians and political parties. And so I would say that despite the public's overwhelming opposition to be careful what I say there, not an overwhelming opposition to politicians, but an overwhelming opposition to legalisation or permissive policies is not reflected in our politicians. We have a real problem there.
I always thought that the Greens would be very opposed to pollution, external pollution at least, but obviously they are in favor of internal pollution of
That's
the
well
content
put.
of drugs. Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay, so what do you think will happen then in the future?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I think what will probably happen, at least in the near term, is that people pushing for more permissive policies will keep chipping away at the winnables. They will keep pushing for medical marijuana, which hasn't really happened here in Australia, unlike many American states. We've resisted that so far, but they'll keep pushing for that and see that as part of the cause. And I think they'll also revisit the heroin trials. I think that's seen by many as a winnable issue. And again, depending on the political landscape at the time when they begin to push that way, it may well get through this time. That's my pessimistic view about that. So in the longer term, once the public does become more accustomed to things like medical marijuana in their consciousness, and the medically supervised injecting room, which has had very, very positive reports, but in my view, deeply flawed reports. That starts to filter through, and so I think the problem for us with the public is that kind of thinking, and if those changes do happen, will have an effect on that opposition to legalisation that is currently there. And I think the other thing, I haven't actually said anything much about this debate last night, but one of the speakers who was in favour, speaking on the in favour of legalisation side, as a former director of public prosecutions in our biggest state, New South Wales. And so he has recently retired, which gives him a lot of opportunity to speak very frankly, although incidentally, he didn't seem to have too much trouble speaking frankly about his favour of legalisation while he was in the position either. But that, if you like, the criminal argument is one that has a certain degree of traction because people have been on the receiving end of a certain degree of crime. Quite a few people have done break and enters, and if that message is really put out strongly that the connection between drugs and crime is so strong that if we were to legalise, that would all be dismantled. So that has a certain amount of intuitive appeal to the public, even though I think it's also a deeply flawed argument because it assumes in one breath that people who are would now have access to legal drugs will suddenly stop doing any sort of criminal activity. It also assumes that organised crime will just pack up their bags and go home. I don't think either are true. And the increased levels of use that one would expect, and I think are almost guaranteed to occur with legalisation, could well result in quite a significant explosion of crime as people become more dysfunctional through their drug use and commit all sorts of other crime besides breaking and entering crimes as a consequence of their drug use. So I think that criminal argument is one that we have a lot of difficulty with because nowhere have we really seen with real clarity. Obviously, there are some examples, historical examples of legalisation and permissive movements that have caused problems with crime. But the card they have up their sleeves, of course, is prohibition in America, prohibition of alcohol in America. Again, I don't think that's terribly well understood, but it's put out there always as the example of how to clean up crime by making something legal. So that criminal side of the argument is a problem.
But still, if you would make it legal, there's reason to believe that if people get the impression that, well, if it's legal, it's not dangerous, so there's obviously a risk that more people are going to use drugs, and then you might increase the problem.
I think there's no doubt about that. I think one thing that is downplayed very strongly is the powerful educative value in the law. Good propagandists know the power of a message, and I think the permissive movement knows that as well. And if they can get the law to change at whatever level, in whatever small way, in a more permissive direction, they recognise the power of that message and how it influences people's thinking and people's perception. I think particularly the young. It's interesting, one of the things which came up in the debate last night was a kind of a sense that, everyone's a rational adult, all very sensible, all very sane, give them their free choices, and they won't use drugs, or they will, and they'll do it safely, and so on. But what that fails to recognise is, number one, the fact that most societies say that if you're under 16, you're not fully a rational adult able to make those sorts of decisions. You're actually vulnerable. We don't allow children to consent to a whole range of things. And so that fails to realise that significant next part of our community, if you like, is the really big vulnerable party who will not be making simple, straightforward, rational choices. They'll be making all sorts of dangerous choices because of the influences upon them, and they'll be inducted into use, and then the use rates go up. And I think this is a critical little statistic here, is which I think many people would be aware of, is that if you have not used any drug by the time you're 20, 21, you're very unlikely to from that point onwards. But if you have used anything much like cannabis or anything else when you're 13, 14, 15, your chances of continuing in that use are much increased, which of course is not unexpected with drugs which have the addiction potential that those substances have.
Okay, Dr. Pike. We thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, and we might get back to you to see if there are any further results of the discussion yesterday, and also about the further development in your country. So thank you very much for talking to us.